Okay, that's all looking good now. So we've got the cake mixer over here. I thought I'd do it with a transparent bowl so you guys can see how the batter kind of goes through the different phases as it comes together as a cake. So we'll start with just again going through the recipe itself. I'm just going to keep myself honest and keep my copy in front of me. We've got to start with 200 grams of butter. So that's just butter that I've cubed up and it's at room temperature, and that just goes in. Now I baked the cake last night with almond butter instead of regular butter, and I thought it was quite nice. What it helps is a great substitute for butter. What I did find was when I made it, it was quite thick, the batter. So I ended up adding a couple of tablespoons of almond milk just to loosen it up. Yeah, and so I'm excited to taste it. I think it's going to taste quite good, but that's always, it's not entirely vegan because this cake still has eggs, but it's always good to have that as an option to play around with as well. So it's going with butter and sugar. Now I'm using a sugar substitute. I'm using Natvia. So it's slightly less than 150 grams of sugar that goes in rather than the full 150 because that's too sweet. I use about somewhere between 100 and 125 grams. So that's again for those that are conscious in their sugar intake and are trying to be better about it. I'm just going to drop that down to mix up, and then we'll come back to add the eggs next. So what typically needs to happen is the butter and the sugar need to kind of almost come together into this creamy, light, fluffy looking. It almost looks like frosting. And that's what we need to get to. So we'll let this guy spin up and hopefully he gets there relatively quickly, and then I'll show that to you. But what ends up happening though, if you don't cream it properly, and then you add the egg, it'll end up becoming a little bit dense, the cake, as opposed to not terribly fluffy. It's not like a sponge cake either, but what we want to make sure is it has the opportunity to soak up some of the syrup that we'll pour on top of it. And it's important that you get the eggs, the butter and the sugar beaten up nice and proper at the beginning. So that's not quite there yet, so I'm still going to let it go. Hopefully you can see that. So I want to get rid of the lumps. I kind of want to let that butter soften down and let it really sort of mix in with the sugar, or sugar substitute rather. I'm just going to let that go for a little bit more. That's looking better. I'm just going to speed it up so that we can really get it really cream. Yes. Here's the butter and sugar, so you can hopefully see that it's still in lumps, but the sugar is nicely mushed into the butter, so it's not kind of floating around on its own anymore. And so that should be in a good enough place. And I'll start adding in the eggs. I'm going to go one egg yolk at a time, and I'll keep doing that progressively just to make sure it gets incorporated properly. There we go. A little bit of white. It'll cooperate with me. And we'll keep mixing that up. There we go. A little bit dense. I've done that before and I've learned the hard way. So that's probably why I don't do it. But yeah, one by one's always better. It just gives a chance for that yolk to smear all the way around the butter and sugar. There we go. I think the eggs are coming along nicely, which means we're getting ready to put in the dry ingredients. So I haven't changed the recipe with the cake. 25 grams of almond meal have gone in. I'm putting now 100 grams of gluten-free flour. I'm choosing gluten-free, it doesn't have to be, but I try to keep a gluten-free household. With that, I'm going in with half a teaspoon of just table salt, so fine salt. I'm going in with a teaspoon of baking powder, I think it is. I measured this out this morning, so I didn't have to fumble around with measuring spoons. And now the recipe calls for 12 cardamom pods that you're meant to crack open and pound. And whilst that works, I find personally with this recipe that ground cardamom is better. Now, I don't typically keep a lot of ground cardamom at home because it doesn't have a long shelf life. So I'll buy, I was saying to mom this morning, I'm like, coffee and cardamom go really well because I'm trying to use up all my cardamom powder. It's how the people in the Middle East drink coffee. They call it coffee kahwa or Arabic kahwa, which is basically coffee with cardamom. But yes, I've used cardamom powder. So 12 pods, the equivalent would be 2 teaspoons. And I'm heavy-handed with the cardamom because I actually like cardamom. So you can always go 1.5 or 1 teaspoon if you don't want it to be too strong. But I struggle with, I struggle to think that cardamom can overpower anything. It's just such a background, chilled out flavor that you could never use too much of it, in my opinion. But that's only because I like it, so I'm biased. So I'm just going to mix that up and switch the mixer back on in case it gets noisy. But yes, that's everything that's gone in there. I called out. I'm going to start doing the lemon juice. So I've got my juicer over here, and I've got, now the recipe says 1 lemon, but I've got 2 smaller lemons. So I'm going to go with the smaller amount of lemon, the larger amount of 2 lemons, and I'll zest both as well. And the reason for that is because I'm not actually using lemons for the rest of the recipe. So in the icing and, oh no, I am using some of it in the syrup, but in the icing, I'm not using lemon juice at all. And so I'm going to try and zing it up in here and add a little bit of extra. So I'm just going to go ahead and slice, well, actually, I'll zest it first. Just going to toss this one around one more time and then keep him going. Then I'll zest up the lemon. So I'm going to zest this guy up really quick and then pop him in here. And then we will juice them up. So they're nice and soft now because I just roll them on the countertop, which is always good to do with lemons or any citrus for the matter. Mixer bowl, I'm just going to go ahead and do 2 of these lemons all juiced up and poured in. And then there's also a tablespoon of rose essence that needs to go into the batter. And then that's it. That just gets mixed up all the way to the end. And then we'll put it in to the cake pan. I'm using a 9-inch or around a 22.5 round spring form cake pan, just to make sure you can pop him out. And yeah, it's the cake does start to creep away from the edges, as you probably know, Kathy, as it bakes. It does shrink slightly. What I do as well for this recipe is I actually keep the cake in the oven an extra 10 minutes longer. And the reason I do that is because I like that it creates these golden edges around on the wall of the cake, which it doesn't do if you just keep it in for the 45 minutes. And it also dries up the cake a little bit because I actually double the syrup recipe for this cake. When I first made it, I was just like, that is just an insufficient amount of syrup by my standards. That is, I'm like, I'm doubling this up. So I'm using the rose essence and I'm going in with a full tablespoon, which is what the recipe calls for rose water. And yes, the whole house smells of rose, which I love because it just makes me feel like it's Valentine's Day every day whenever I bake this cake. But yes, I'm going to mix that up now. And that's it. Everything in there is done. I'll give it a proper stir because it's got all those wonderful flavors of lemon and rose all gonna jump around in there and make friends. And then I've got a 9-inch cake pan. As I mentioned, I've lined it with baking paper and I have greased it as well so that it comes off easily. I'm just gonna switch cameras because maybe this camera will be better for you to see me pour it into, don't mind my coffee, pour it into and the cake pan before it goes into the oven. And then what we'll do, the cake, I timed this well, the cake's 2 minutes from being done. I'm just gonna check on him and make sure he's coming along quite nicely. Yeah, he is. This cake batter is really thick. I'm sure, Kathy, you would have had the similar experience. So it can be quite difficult to kind of get a smooth layer on the top. And that's where the glaze helps. It just kind of, you know, gives you an opportunity to not get a perfect surface because you can just cover it up with glaze. Rose. I'm just gonna give that one more stir, and actually you can see that, can't you? Let me just move him over here a little bit. So he's almost done. You can see the batter's quite thick. So I'm gonna do my best to get him in here, and then we'll pop him into the oven. But while I wait for that to finish up, I'm just gonna take the one that is in the oven out, so bear with me. All right. Close that back up to keep him warm. All right, I'm gonna have to flatten out this guy. Just take a little bit of work to kind of get it pretty and semi-flat. I won't say flat because it is difficult to do that. But the reason for it is because it's predominantly almond meal, this cake, which is why the syrup makes it taste like a cake, because it almost bakes like a biscuit in a sense, because it's quite thin. And in fact, you could probably do it with an 8-inch pan rather than a 9-inch for that reason, because he doesn't rise too high. And it's not the kind of cake where it gets golden brown on top either. In fact, I might just quickly show you. I've just pulled this one out of the oven, and he's, you know, golden around the edges, but you know, pretty much flat and still beige. So hopefully you can see that. Can you see how it's golden? Because I've kept it in there an extra 10 minutes around the corners. But the middle, it still looks like it's, is that cake cooked? Here we go. So we're gonna figure out this guy and do a little bit of pretend icing work. We're gonna smush him down, basically. But yeah, so look, we're almost done here with this guy. We're gonna pop him into the oven. I'm trying to get him to be as flat without being, if you follow the right instructions around making sure that you do the eggs and the buttercream properly before you add the eggs, it should have that effect. So as best you can without being too precious, and that should be fine. And that'll go into the oven. And then we will start to prepare the syrup so that we can throw it on top of the cake that's just come out of the oven, which is going to be fun. Would have been a very steamy hot cake then. So I'm just going to pop this in the oven now for 15 minutes. So again, that's an extra 10 minutes to the cake that I did. So sorry, to the recipe that Yasmin's written out, because as I mentioned, I like the golden edges on it. So I'm just going to pop that up to 50. And that should be good. Okay, and I'm just going to get rid of this guy, and I'll bring out the stove so we can do the syrup together. Just there. So we're going to grab a little pot, and we're just going to create the syrup. Now the syrup doesn't have to be cooked to death. It's really more about getting the sugar to melt. And as soon as the sugar is dissolved, it's done. So that's, again, not 2, but 4 tablespoons going in of just raw sugar, because I'm doubling the syrup recipe, as I mentioned before, because I like my syrup. That's 4 tablespoons. It needs it. Spoken from experience. That's, again, I think it said 3/4 of a lemon. So I've done almost 2 lemons, 2 small lemons here. So that's going in as well. And that should dissolve quite nicely. And I think it calls for a tablespoon, so half a tablespoon of rose water. Again, I'm using rose water and rose essence interchangeably. And so I'm putting in a whole tablespoon here because it's a double recipe. And so that should all go in. And let that boil up really quick. Well, at least melt down. And it should be ready to go in a tick. And I'll grab the cake, and yeah, that's completely melted. So I don't want it to evaporate too much water, because if it does that, then again, I run out of syrup, and that's cool to the touch now. So I'm just gonna grab him, and we're gonna just go, I've got a cake tester, or any toothpick really, and as generously as possible, as many holes that you can puncture all through the cake, and same as you would do for any syrup cake. And it's good to do this while it's warm, because I've actually done this after it cooled down too much, and the top layer does kind of create a bit of a crunchy crust. The recipe, I think, says you should take the cake out of the pan first. I like keeping it in the pan just so that it can keep like a catchment, keep all the syrup in case anything kind of slides off, give it an opportunity to get it absorbed. It's safety proof, fail safe rather. So that's the hot syrup going on. And I typically start in the middle, and I just kind of keep going around bit by bit by bit, because it doesn't just necessarily go directly in, because it is a dense cake. So we kind of want to give it a minute to figure out that it should be falling into the crevices. And you'll see how it's kind of just sliding down to the sides. And that's one of the reasons why I like to keep the cake in the cake pan, so it still has an opportunity to get absorbed at some point. But you'll see now this time that because I have so much syrup, there's plenty to go around. Before it was just, I was kind of done at that point. I'm like, I need more syrup. So yeah. It's great, smells great. Can't go wrong, I reckon, with a syrup cake any day of the week. Always a mood lifter. Yeah, so I'm just gonna let that kind of slowly sink in. And this is why I kind of made sure I did as many holes as I could, because it really does help the absorption process through. I've still got a bit of syrup and I don't want it to go to waste. I'm actually going to go at it with more holes just so that it has the opportunity to really get in there. But yeah, once this is done, we'll just let this guy cool. And I have a cake that I made last night that I'll use to do the icing because it's still too warm. And if you put any kind of glaze on it, it'll just stay as a glaze. It won't harden. We'll have another waterfall effect. All right, I think I'm just gonna let that all kind of sit in there for a little while. There is quite a bit more syrup than I'm typically used to. Not that I'm complaining. I'm just gonna let that sit to absorb. And that probably will sit. Look, it's still quite warm. I would keep it for at least 4 hours before I would do any kind of a glaze on it. And so if you're impatient and you don't want to do a glaze, like I mentioned, I would smush the pistachios in before it goes into the oven. And when it comes out, you can do the syrup and sprinkle rose petals and you can have it warm. If you were wanting to have it warm, like so, I just give it sort of 30 to 60 minutes to kind of cool down and make sure that that syrup has a chance to really get in there. Sprinkle some rose petals and you're good. But yeah, if you want to do the icing, I would at least let it sit for 4 hours. And you could put it in the fridge to get it kind of to speed up the cooling process. But if you want, you can wait and just kind of let that come to a cool naturally, which is sometimes better because if you put it into the fridge, then the cake becomes dense and it's refrigerated and it doesn't taste the same. Much better to be patient, I think, in those instances. All right, I'm just gonna grab the other cake that I baked from last night. So as you can see, I might actually just quickly pop this camera back on. Like he mentioned, it doesn't really rise up. It's more like a big biscuit. And so this is the one I made with almond butter. And I decided because the almond butter was already quite dry and dense that I didn't want to do a syrup for this one. So this one I just let it rest overnight and I'm going to do the glaze now. So I'm going to go back to the top camera. Actually, I'll show you as well. I've just got a like a cookie sheet tray underneath and some parchment baking paper. I'm just going to use that to sit on top of the grill so that I can glaze it and let everything kind of fall down to the sides. And then I'll put it onto a cake pan. And then it'll be ready to serve. As I mentioned, I'm doing two tablespoons of almond milk instead of lemon juice because that gives the nice white flavor and it's quite creamy compared to lemon juice at least. So that's 2 tablespoons that are going in. And I'll add more if I decide that I need to because it's icing. You kind of want to make sure that it's not too loose because once it's too loose, you have to add more icing sugar and all that stuff, and it's a bit tricky. So I go with less is more, and then I'll add as I need if it's still too thick or lumpy. And so that was the 2 tablespoons of almond milk. Now I'm just doing half a tablespoon or 2 teaspoons of rose essence. Yeah, I typically get through at least 3 of these bottles whenever I bake the cake. Be fine. Okay. So I'm back to this guy. I've just got a little whisk. I'm just going to kind of stir him in. The idea is to, as you and most of you have made a glaze before, so I'm speaking to a panel of experts, but you kind of want to get rid of the lumps. And as you can see already, and Kathy, this is more for you, because I've used almond milk, can you see how the glaze is more white than it would be if it was with lemon juice? Yeah. And that's really what I quite liked about it. So I'm going to do my best to get rid of all the lumps. There's always lumps. In fact, what I try to do with icing sugar is I go in with a fork and I try to break as many lumps as I can before I even add any liquid, just so that I don't have to deal with the lumps in the liquid. But yeah, I think we're good. There's still a few lumps here, but I'm not going to be terribly precious about it. And so that's just going to go over the cake. So you can see this cake has lots of different ridges and it's not a smooth layer. That's where we'll camouflage it all with the icing and the rose petals and pistachios. So I have those guys. That's probably more than a teaspoon of each. I think she said 2 teaspoons. I've got, I think, 2 tablespoons. Yeah, that's it. And so I always give myself that luxury. So more is more, and then you can always have it on the side if you decide you don't want to put it on the cake. So I'm just gonna, it's tricky with glaze because once it's down, it's down. So you kind of just have to let it do its thing and help it along. So I think, let's try let it creep out over there. But yeah, that's it. I'm not gonna try and be overly precious. It will drip quite a bit off. That's normal, in my opinion. It's always tricky with glaze because you go, oh, I've made all this glaze, but I want to eat the glaze, but it's all falling off the cake. That's so not fair. So I usually go with pistachios first, a couple of those, and then a couple of rose petals, and then back to the pistachios, because the pistachios can kind of anchor down any loose leaves rather than just being sort of sitting underneath while the rose petals quickly slide off. So I'm going to go back with more on the sides. Yeah, green and the pink together. I think it just goes really beautifully together. So now I'm going to become a little bit deliberate and try and fill in some of the holes. But beyond that, we have our cake and it's ready to be served. Yes, I usually like with any cake, just do a little bit of a glue with whatever is left over. And then I'm just going to pick him up and pop him down, and voila, there we go, Persian love cake. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you very soon.